Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be unpacking the story of the prophet Elijah.
Okay.
We're going to be using a lecture by Bertrand Comparet as our guide.
Okay.
Trust me, he offers some really interesting interpretations.
Mhm.
Elijah's life was full of dramatic confrontations,
Mhm.
incredible miracles, and even a mysterious disappearance.
Right.
By the end of this, you might even be wondering if there's a chance he could return.
Yeah, one of the things that always fascinated me about Elijah's story is that despite the impact he had,
Yeah,
he didn't leave behind any writings of his own.
that's true. It makes him even more enigmatic, don't you think?
Absolutely.
So to really understand him, we need to look at the world that he lived in.
Hmm?
So Elijah was around when the kingdom of Israel, once united under King David, was split in two.
Yeah, and that division really stemmed from some pretty significant choices made by King Solomon, David's son. He was known for his wisdom,
Right.
but he also made some unwise decisions, particularly when it came to marriage.
Solomon's many foreign wives influenced him to allow the worship of other gods in the kingdom,
Right.
which directly contradicted the instructions given to the Israelites.
And according to Comparet Solomon's son, Rehoboam wasn't even supposed to inherit the throne because his mother was an Ammonite woman. Deuteronomy specifically forbids foreigners from ruling over Israel.
That's a detail I never really considered before. It really highlights how much tension was already brewing even before the kingdom split.
Absolutely.
When Rehoboam became king, the people asked him to ease the burdens that his father had placed on them. But he refused, and that led to revolt.
And 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel chose Jeroboam from the tribe of Ephraim as their king.
Okay.
And that's how the kingdom was divided.
So the northern kingdom was ruled by Jeroboam, and the southern kingdom, Judah, stayed loyal to the Davidic dynasty.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have this divided kingdom. Where does Elijah fit into all of this?
Well, this is where Jeroboam makes a decision with some pretty lasting consequences. Worried that his people might switch their allegiance back to the Davidic kings in the south.
Right.
If they continued worshiping in Jerusalem, he established a new form of worship in the north.
Oh.
He set up golden calves in Dan and Bethel, creating a rival religion that discouraged his people from going south to Jerusalem.
So he basically used religion as a political strategy, which is something we still see today.
It is a recurring theme throughout history.
Right.
And while this move was politically savvy, it pulled the northern kingdom further into idolatry.
Right.
And it's into this world of political maneuvering and religious corruption that Elijah emerges.
His name itself, Elijah, meaning God is Yahweh, makes a powerful statement, especially during a time when Yahweh's worship had been largely abandoned.
Absolutely. It's a bold declaration of faith in the face of widespread idolatry.
And talk about making a dramatic entrance. Elijah appears before King Ahab, one of Jeroboam's successors, and he declares a drought.
Right.
This was a direct challenge to the king's authority and a consequence of the nation turning away from Yahweh.
This is a really defining moment in the story.
Yeah.
Elijah, standing alone, dares to confront the most powerful person in the land and pronounce judgment upon him and the entire kingdom.
This was a risky move. Ahab's wife Jezebel was known for ruthlessly persecuting the prophets of Yahweh.
In fact, she had systematically eliminated almost all of them, leaving Elijah as the sole voice of defiance.
You know, there are definitely parallels between Elijah and John the Baptist.
Absolutely.
Both were solitary figures who challenged corrupt rulers.
Right.
It makes you think about the personal cost of speaking truth to power and how some are willing to face that for their beliefs.
It's a timeless theme, isn't it?
Yeah.
We have this incredibly tense situation, Elijah, the unwavering prophet, versus Ahab and Jezebel, the rulers of the corrupt northern kingdom.
Right.
And this tension builds and builds until it leads to one of the most dramatic showdowns in the Bible, the confrontation on Mount Carmel.
Okay, so 3 years pass. The drought has devastated the land. The people are desperate for relief. And this is when Elijah reappears, challenging the prophets of Baal to a contest, a public spectacle, to prove once and for all which God is the true God.
It's such a brilliant challenge on so many levels. It taps into the people's desire for the dramatic, and it forces them to really face the consequences of their actions.
I mean, can you imagine being there on Mount Carmel? Hundreds of prophets of Baal are frantically calling on their God to send fire from heaven to consume their sacrifice, but nothing happens.
Yeah, and then there's Elijah just calm and collected, even mocking the prophets of Baal.
Right.
He suggests that maybe their God is asleep or on a journey or just too busy to answer them.
Right.
Yeah.
And then just to up the stakes, he rebuilds the altar of Yahweh,
Yeah.
drenching it in water before calling upon the name of Yahweh. And what happens? Fire falls from heaven.
And the timing couldn't be more symbolic. It coincides with the traditional time for the evening sacrifice, reinforcing Yahweh's power over these false gods.
The people were awestruck, and they proclaimed Yahweh, he is God.
It's a moment of total upheaval. Elijah had proven Yahweh's power, exposed the false gods, and publicly humiliated Ahab and the prophets of Baal.
But of course, Jezebel was furious and swore revenge.
And once again, Elijah had to flee for his life.
And that brings us to another fascinating part of his story, his miracles and prophecies. We're talking about a man who was sustained by ravens, or possibly Arabs, as Comparet suggests, during the drought.
Yeah, Comparet believes that the Hebrew word for raven could also mean Arab, which makes sense considering ravens aren't known for sharing food. He argues that Elijah might have been helped by nomadic tribesmen.
It's a good reminder that ancient texts can be nuanced, and a single word can have multiple meanings depending on the context.
Absolutely. It shows how important it is to carefully examine the original languages and the context when studying these ancient texts.
So we have these incredible miracles, the ravens, the widow's endless supply of oil and flour, his escape from Jezebel.
Right.
And they all point to the power of faith and divine intervention.
These miracles aren't just random occurrences. They show how Yahweh provides for and protects those who are faithful to him, especially during times of hardship.
Right.
Think about how the drought was a direct result of turning away from Yahweh, and yet he still provides for Elijah through unexpected means.
It's a powerful message about trusting in a higher power, even when things seem bleak.
It is. It highlights the contrast between those who rely on false hope and those who trust in the true God.
Then there's Elijah's journey to Mount Horeb, where he encounters a windstorm, an earthquake, and fire, these incredible displays of power. But Yahweh wasn't in any of them.
This is such a crucial lesson. God's power isn't always shown in the most obvious or dramatic ways. Sometimes it's in the quiet, subtle moments that we truly connect with him.
And that's exactly what happens. Yahweh speaks to Elijah in a still small voice, instructing him to anoint Elisha as his successor and to set in motion events that would ultimately lead to the downfall of Ahab and Jezebel.
This sets up a really interesting dynamic between Elijah and Elisha. When Elisha requests a double portion of Elijah's spirit, it's not about wanting more power, but inheriting his legacy and authority.
It's about continuing the mission, passing the torch to the next generation.
Exactly. Elisha's asking to be recognized as Elijah's rightful heir.
And then in a truly spectacular exit, Elijah is taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire, leaving Elisha to carry on his work.
This dramatic departure leads to some big questions. Was it literal or symbolic? And what does it mean for his potential return?
That's a great place to stop for now. When we come back, we'll dig deeper into the more controversial aspects of Elijah's story as interpreted by Bertrand Comparet.
Welcome back. Let's dive into some of the more intriguing interpretations that Bertrand Comparet offers about Elijah's story.
Right.
Remember those ravens we talked about? The ones that fed Elijah during the drought?
Right. I have to admit, I always found that detail a little hard to swallow. No pun intended.
Well, Comparet suggests that the word translated as ravens could actually refer to Arabs, nomadic tribesmen who had been familiar with the harsh desert conditions. And it makes a lot more sense considering ravens aren't exactly known for their hospitality.
I see your point. It would have been much easier for a group of people to provide sustenance than a flock of ravens.
Right.
Plus, it highlights the idea that even during times of intense hardship, Yahweh can provide for his faithful through unexpected sources.
Precisely. It emphasizes the importance of trusting in God's provision, even when it comes from seemingly unlikely places. It also speaks to the importance of understanding the nuances of the Hebrew language and considering different interpretations.
It's like a whole new layer of meaning opens up. It makes you realize how much can be lost in translation.
Absolutely. It highlights the importance of careful scholarship and the need to consider multiple perspectives. Speaking of multiple perspectives, Comparet's take on Elijah's confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel is particularly insightful.
Yes, that's definitely one of the most dramatic events in Elijah's story. What unique insights does Comparet offer?
Well, he sees it as more than just a religious showdown. He views it as a clash of civilizations, a battle for the very soul of the nation. It was a conflict between the worship of Yahweh, the God of Israel, and the allure of pagan deities, which were very prevalent at the time.
It's fascinating to think about it in those terms. It wasn't just about proving whose God was stronger. It was about defining the moral and spiritual identity of the nation.
Exactly. And remember, Baal worship specifically was considered a major threat to Israelite society.
Why was that?
Well, Baal was a fertility god associated with things like rain, thunder, and agricultural abundance.
Okay.
His worship often involved rituals that were considered immoral and depraved by the Israelites.
Hmm.
Embracing Baal meant turning away from the very foundations of their faith and their law.
So in a way, Elijah was challenging the cultural norms of the time, fighting against practices that were considered acceptable by many, but went against the core tenets of his faith.
You could say that he was a voice of dissent, calling for a return to the purity of Yahweh worship.
And by calling down fire from heaven, he undeniably showed that Yahweh was the true God, the source of all life and blessings.
Right. It was a public demonstration of power that was impossible to ignore, and yet, despite this incredible victory, the northern kingdom continued down a path of idolatry and moral decay.
It's sad that even after witnessing such a powerful event, Ahab and Jezebel didn't truly repent. Their hearts remained hardened.
It goes to show that sometimes even the most dramatic miracles don't lead to genuine change.
Right.
True transformation requires more than just seeing something amazing. It requires a willingness to surrender to God's will, to turn away from wickedness, and to fully embrace a life of righteousness.
It's like that saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
Exactly. People have to be willing to change, to turn away from their old ways and embrace something new.
Right.
So while the showdown on Mount Carmel was a pivotal moment, it wasn't the end of the story. The struggle between faith and idolatry continued, and it's a struggle that's still relevant today.
I can see that. We may not face the same gods as the ancient Israelites, but we definitely face our own idols,
Yeah.
our own temptations to stray from what we believe is right. What stands out to you as some of the modern-day Baals we might grapple with?
That's a great question. I think anything that we prioritize above our relationship with God could be considered a modern-day Baal. It could be material possessions, status power, or even ideologies that we elevate above everything else.
It's a good reminder to constantly evaluate our priorities and make sure we're not putting anything before our faith.
Absolutely. It's an ongoing process of self-reflection and seeking alignment with our core values. But let's shift gears for a bit and talk about another intriguing part of Elijah's story. His anointing of Elisha as his successor. Compare it delves into the significance of Elisha's request for a double portion of Elijah's spirit.
Yes, that's something I've always been curious about. What was Elisha really asking for?
Well, Compare it emphasizes that it wasn't about wanting more power than Elijah, but about inheriting his legacy and authority. He understood that true leadership isn't about personal gain, but about serving a higher purpose.
He wanted to carry on the work Elijah had started, to be a faithful prophet and a voice of truth, even in a world filled with corruption. That's a powerful aspiration.
It is, and it's important to note that Elisha's request wasn't about trying to outdo his mentor. It was about acknowledging the importance of lineage and the continuation of the prophetic tradition.
It's like he was saying, I want to build upon the foundation you've laid and continue the work you've started.
Precisely. It speaks to the importance of mentorship and discipleship in the development of spiritual leaders. Elijah didn't just disappear, he invested in someone who could continue his work.
It's a powerful reminder that we don't grow in isolation. We need guidance, support, and inspiration from those who have walked the path before us.
And we, in turn, have a responsibility to mentor and disciple others, sharing our knowledge, experience, and faith to help them on their own journeys.
It's a beautiful cycle, a passing of the torch from one generation to the next. And speaking of passing the torch, let's talk about the dramatic climax of Elijah's story. His ascent to heaven in a chariot of fire. It's a scene that has captivated people for centuries. What are your thoughts on this event?
I think it's one of the most powerful and mysterious events in the Bible. Compare it acknowledges the mystery surrounding it, suggesting that it could be interpreted both literally and symbolically.
I like that perspective. It allows for different levels of understanding and interpretation.
Exactly. On one level, it's a testament to God's power, his ability to intervene in human affairs in extraordinary ways.
Right.
But it can also be seen as a metaphor for the spiritual journey, the ascent of the soul toward God.
It reminds us that our true purpose and ultimate destination lie beyond this earthly realm.
It does, and it leaves us with a sense of hope and wonder. Even in the face of death, there's the possibility of transcendence and eternal life. However, it's important to remember that Compare It doesn't shy away from the more challenging aspects of Elijah's story.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there's the violence, the judgment, the unwavering commitment to upholding God's law, even when it meant taking drastic action. These are not aspects we should gloss over.
It's true. Elijah's story can be unsettling at times, especially for modern sensibilities. But I think it's important to remember the context of the time and the challenges he faced.
Absolutely. And Compare It presents a view of Elijah that is both inspiring and unsettling. He was a prophet who was deeply dedicated to righteousness and willing to confront wickedness head-on, even at great personal risk.
Hmm.
It's a reminder that faith isn't always comfortable or easy. Sometimes it requires us to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's unpopular or dangerous.
It's a challenge to examine our own lives, our own commitments, and ask ourselves if we're willing to be as bold and uncompromising in our pursuit of truth and righteousness. It's easy to stay silent when we see things we disagree with, but Elijah's story inspires us to speak up and act on our convictions.
I agree. It's a call to authentic faith, a faith that isn't just about words, but about action and a willingness to make difficult choices. And speaking of difficult choices, what about the prophecy of Elijah's return? That's a topic that deserves its own discussion.
Yes, it does. When we come back, we'll explore the intriguing possibility of Elijah's reappearance and what it might mean for us today. Stay tuned. Welcome back. We've covered a lot of ground in our exploration of Elijah. We talked about his confrontations with power, the miracles he performed, his dedication to his faith, and now we're at one of the most fascinating aspects of his story, the prophecy of his return.
It's a prophecy that has sparked a lot of debate and interpretation for centuries. In the book of Malachi, it states that Elijah will return before the great and dreadful day of the Lord.
And this is where Bertrand Comparet's perspective gets really interesting.
Yeah.
He points out that some people believe that this prophecy was fulfilled by John the Baptist.
Right.
After all, John the Baptist came in the spirit and power of Elijah and even dressed like him.
That's true. There are definite similarities between the two. However, the prophecy specifically mentions Elijah himself, returning not just someone who embodies his spirit or power.
So Comparet suggests that maybe John the Baptist was like a foreshadowing of Elijah's eventual return.
Oh.
That Elijah still has a role to play in preparing the world for what's to come.
Yeah, he proposes that Elijah's mission might not be complete.
That's a powerful thought. Imagine Elijah appearing in our world today, confronting corruption, calling people back to righteousness, maybe even performing miracles. It would be a global event.
It would certainly shake things up. Comparet argues that a figure like Elijah is needed now more than ever, a voice of truth and justice in a time when it seems like those things are increasingly disregarded.
You're right. The world is facing so many challenges. It does make you wonder if a prophetic figure like Elijah could be what we need to wake up and see a better path forward.
Of course, this raises a lot of questions. If Elijah were to return, when and where would he appear? What would his message be? How would the world react?
It's hard to say for sure, but those are the kinds of questions that really make you think.
Exactly. And while Comparet doesn't offer definitive answers, he encourages us to engage with these ideas, to grapple with their complexities, and to consider their relevance for our own lives.
I think that's what's so great about this deep dive. It's not about arriving at concrete conclusions, but about opening our minds to new possibilities and wrestling with big questions. It's about taking the time to really think about these ancient stories and what they might mean for us today.
I agree. The story of Elijah isn't just a historical relic. It's a story that continues to challenge and inspire us.
It reminds us that faith can be a powerful force for change, that even in the face of incredible odds, one person can make a real difference.
And it challenges each of us to stand up for what we believe in, to speak truth to power, and to live with integrity and purpose.
After this deep dive, I feel like I'm looking at the world and even my own life with fresh eyes. It's been an incredible journey exploring the life and legacy of Elijah.
And remember, the journey doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the captivating story of Elijah the prophet. We'll see you next time.